There is a curious phenomenon that exists among football fans, and it is the ability for a certain set of ideas to become pervasive with either very little or sometimes even no justification. Okay, I'm being a little harsh on football fans of course, since it exists throughout all walks of life, but it is the world of football that is always in focus on this channel. In the summer of 2018, Gareth Southgate could have walked on water. As England won their first penalty shootout since 1996 and reached the semi-finals of the World Cup for the first time since Italia in '90, the nation seemed to be in almost unanimous agreement that Gareth Southgate was a man who could do no wrong. A chorus of "Southgate, you're the one, you still turn me on, football's coming home again" echoed down the streets of Moscow and back home to street corners in Manchester, Maidstone and Middlesbrough. Sales of M&S waistcoats was the primary cause of UK growth in 2018, as a man, who I once heard described as looking like a grand piano with the lid up, suddenly became a fashion icon. That was less than 2.5 years ago, and yet now the mood surrounding Southgate is very different. While social media is rarely an accurate reflection of society as a whole, during the COVID era, there are few other ways in which to gauge public opinion. Every time there is an international break, Twitter seems to be awash with scathing assessments of Gareth Southgate's talents and his decisions as England boss. Even in the real world, on the often football-dominated group chat that I have with a group of friends, I will rarely find a positive word said about Southgate and frequently see suggestions that he's not up to the job. So what has happened between the summer of 2018 and 2020 for public opinion on Gareth Southgate to have shifted quite so far in a negative direction? Well, in England's first game after the World Cup, they were beaten 2-1 by Spain at Wembley Stadium, in their first UEFA Nations League fixture. However, the Three Lions bounced back, defeating the Spaniards 3-2 in their own backyard in a sensational display, and then seeing off Croatia back at Wembley to qualify for the first UEFA Nations League finals in Portugal. England finished third in the tournament, losing to the Netherlands, but beating Switzerland in two very closely contested games. In Euro 2020 qualifying, England breezed through their group, suffering a disappointing defeat to Czech Republic, but bouncing back with a 6-0 win against Bulgaria and a 7-0 win against Montenegro to meet expectations by topping their group. In the 2020 UEFA Nations League, England have been a bit more of a mixed bag. Taking just 1 point from a possible 6 against Denmark can only be viewed as failure, but the Three Lions also beat the world's number 1 ranked national team Belgium, coming back from behind with their return leg against the Belgians taking place this weekend. What's more, since the 2018 World Cup, England have won every one of their 4 friendly internationals, beating Switzerland, the United States, Wales and the Republic of Ireland. It's really not too bad of a record, and it's a run of form that sees Gareth Southgate's men sitting 4th in the FIFA World Rankings, ahead of the likes of Portugal, Spain, Germany and Argentina. I think it would be fair to say then that the shift in public opinion on the current England boss cannot be motivated by results, which have by and large been pretty impressive. International football is a weird old animal though, in the sense that you could win 90% of your games and still be deemed a failure, since there is so much weight put upon getting results in the big games at the major tournaments. But Gareth Southgate has only had one major tournament, and England reached the semi-finals, so scepticism surrounding his talents seems to be primarily centred around doubts about whether he will be able to get the best out of England at upcoming tournaments, most notably in next summer's Euros, should they go ahead as planned. One of Gareth Southgate's biggest selection dilemmas has come in midfield, and particularly in the number 10 position. Somewhat similarly to Frank Lampard at Chelsea, Southgate currently finds himself with an abundance of talent in the position, and left with a decision to make with regards to who to start and whether he can accommodate more than one of them. The source of much anti-Southgate sentiment seems to surround his lack of love for Jack Grealish and reluctance to start him in games, contrasted with his continued favour for Chelsea man Mason Mount. This issue came to the fore prior to England's friendly game against Ireland, when Southgate responded to one national reporter by stating, "I suppose on that you're referring to Mason, whose only crime is not to be Jack at the moment. I'm also aware I should talk about Mason because then it keeps the memes going of me talking about Mason. So we have got to fulfill all of those requirements just to keep the Villa fans happy, especially. What would they be able to do on social media if they didn't have that opportunity? So yes, of course, I'm aware Jack's playing well." End quote. It's probably worth noting that Gareth Southgate made those comments in a jovial and humorous spirit, and by the same token, I think plenty of criticism of Southgate himself, both surrounding the Grealish debate and more generally, are intended to be taken lightheartedly, rather than as serious critique. But since this is such a crucial issue when it comes to understanding the Gareth Southgate debate, who is right? Southgate or hordes of Villa fans online? One thing that's crucial to know is that Jack Grealish is playing on the left wing for Aston Villa, just as he did for almost all of last season. Now, some have criticised Southgate for suggesting that he sees Grealish as a winger and not as a central midfielder or number 10, but in the England manager's defence, the left wing is where Grealish has played and impressed for Aston Villa in the Premier League. That would create rather a significant dilemma for any England manager, given the plethora of talent that England have in wide areas. The Three Lions can call upon the likes of Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho and Raheem Sterling on the left and right flanks, in addition to the likes of Callum Hudson-Odoi and Harvey Barnes. Opportunities, therefore, are always likely to be at a premium. Jack Grealish admitted as much himself back in February when he told one interviewer, quote, "What will be hard at the moment is with the position I'm playing in at the moment. People would probably say I'm playing as a winger. If you look at England's wingers, I doubt I would have much of a chance of starting in front of Sterling, Sancho and Rashford, who are all unbelievable players. I've always said my favourite position will be playing in midfield. That is where I would love to play for England." Close quote. What's more, it's not just that Marcus Rashford, Raheem Sterling and Jadon Sancho are all very good players, they're also similar players in a number of respects, and they all fit the way in which Gareth Southgate wants England to set up. It has been quite clear ever since Gareth Southgate got the England job that he has wanted quick, direct wide men who will score him goals and make England a constant threat on the counter-attack. It's no surprise to me, therefore, that as Grealish's goal tally has improved in the early parts of this season, along with his physicality, he seems to have shifted a little higher in Gareth Southgate's pecking order. What fans often find hard to understand is that an England manager cannot necessarily just pick his 11 best players. England, for example, have about 5 brilliant right-backs, but are a little lacking at centre-back, left-back, and in holding midfield. When it's something as obvious as a right-back not being able to play elsewhere, people tend to understand, but when it is something a little more nuanced, like Jack Grealish not being exactly the right fit on the wing for Gareth Southgate's system, people are more likely to take umbrage with his omission. To be clear, I think that Jack Grealish is a phenomenal footballer, and I think Gareth Southgate probably feels the same way. However, I also think that Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho and Raheem Sterling are tremendous wide players, and that James Maddison, Mason Mount and Phil Foden are all excellent in that number 10 position. There are some people who say that England have to build their team around Grealish. That is preposterous. England have a handful of very talented players, and to build their team around any one individual would just be absurd. The challenge for Jack Grealish is to play so well for Villa, and when he gets his opportunities for England, that Gareth Southgate has no choice but to pick him. Personally, whilst I thought Gareth Southgate left him out of the England squad for too long, and that he should have introduced him in a couple of fixtures, I don't think his management of the Villa captain is anywhere near as controversial as some people make out. More concerning, perhaps, has been how defensive some of his lineups have appeared at first glance. Clearly, Gareth Southgate is keen to play with a back 3, 2 wing-backs and a front 3, which leaves him with only 2 players in midfield. As a result, he tends to go for 2 sitting players, whether it is Jordan Henderson, Eric Dyer, Declan Rice, Harry Winks, Calvin Phillips, etc, etc. The problem with that is that you essentially end up with a front 3 that are either reliant upon carving out chances for themselves, or from deliveries from the right wing-back, who will most likely be Trent Alexander-Arnold. Consequently, England's front 3 can become quite isolated, and since Southgate's preferred front 3 is Harry Kane, Raheem Sterling, and then either Marcus Rashford or Jadon Sancho, the system doesn't really leave any room for the likes of Grealish, Foden, Maddison, and in truth, Mason Mount. Mount is the most capable of playing in that slightly deeper role where he started against Ireland, but it isn't his best position. To me, England often look too deep set, focused on hitting teams on the break, and lacking in genuine creativity. Occasionally, I wonder whether Gareth Southgate underestimates just how good the players at his disposal are. Outside of France, I don't think there's a national team out there who England shouldn't be able to go toe-to-toe with right now, but I'm not convinced that we set up in a manner which acknowledges that fact. As you can tell, I am not immune to criticising Gareth Southgate, just as every football fan will scrutinise every decision a manager makes. The fact remains, however, that whoever was in charge of England, they would have to make these difficult decisions and upset some people. If a new manager came in and made Jack Grealish captain, Villa fans might be delighted. But if it was in place of Marcus Rashford, or at the expense of Jadon Sancho on the left flank, others would be left feeling perplexed. We ought to be grateful that we have these problems. It was only 2 years ago that Jesse Lingard was starting games for England at a World Cup. That isn't a dig at Jesse Lingard, by the way. I know that's a popular thing to do, but just an acknowledgement of the fact that the England squad has strengthened during that time. And I think that is the crux of Gareth Southgate's problem. In 2018, England travelled to Russia with almost no expectations. Even if the team had gone out in the group stages, plenty of people wouldn't have been all that surprised. At the last major tournament, just 2 years earlier, England had been knocked out by Iceland. Gareth Southgate only got the job after Big Sam was asked to leave for getting caught up in an undercover operation, drinking a pint of white wine. England fans had experienced repeated heartbreak, even with the likes of Becks, Lampard, Gerrard, Rooney, Terry, Ferdinand and Owen in their prime. Now they were heading to a tournament with their least talented group of players on paper for at least a generation. English exceptionalism in a footballing context was at an all-time low. Therefore, the joy of winning a penalty shootout, of making a semi-final, and of having that sense of optimism again was euphoric. That is no longer the case. A number of English players are performing very well at club level, those younger players from 2018 are a bit more experienced, and suddenly there are expectations again. Not necessarily expectations that England should win the Euros, but we're now in a situation where anything short of the semi-finals would most likely be viewed as failure. If you look at the way in which public opinion has shifted on Southgate, he's not actually the only member of England's 2018 World Cup cohort to have suffered such a fate. Take Harry Maguire. He was beloved the length and breadth of England that summer, taken into the nation's heart for his meteoric rise from League One to the Premier League and then into the England squad. Just 2 years on, he now plays for Manchester United, and the spotlight on him is enormous. Harry Maguire is not a worse player now than he was in 2018, and Gareth Southgate isn't a worse manager. It's just that the expectations have changed. In the last few days, I've seen numerous news sites and discussion shows either stating or having guests state that Gareth Southgate isn't up to the job. Even the Facebook page of my own employers shared this post suggesting that Premier League managers letting Gareth Southgate coach their players is akin to lending your Lamborghini to your 17-year-old sister. Well, England have had managers who are used to driving the Lamborghinis of world football in the past. And look how it went. You could hardly find a manager with a more impressive CV than Fabio Capello, who was despised by most of his squad and would never get a tune out of a brilliant group of players at a major tournament. Sven had worked wonders in Serie A, but he could never get England's most talented team since '66 over the line. Gareth Southgate might not have the credentials of those two, but he has already achieved more during his short stint as England boss than both of them combined. The England team seem to have bought into his ideas, they seem to respect him and want to impress him. I never like the mantra of be careful what you wish for, but we ought to recognise what we have got. I'm not saying that Gareth Southgate is a world-class manager or that he's going to lead England to glory at the Euros or at a World Cup. But he has done an admirable job to date, and the idea that the FA should sack him prior to a major tournament, when in his only previous major tournament he took a totally unfavoured England team to the semi-finals, is absolutely absurd. Anyhow, I've no doubt that this video will prove to be an unpopular one, since the tide of online opinion already appears to have turned when it comes to Gareth Southgate. But I honestly believe that some of the criticism of him is wildly overblown and unjustified, and whilst I don't agree with every one of his decisions, his results deserve recognition. And I honestly don't see anyone out there who you could bet your bottom dollar on doing a better job right now. So that is it for today's video, but thank you all as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you did enjoy today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. Oh, and you can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram, where the username is just @HITC Sevens on both.